This is a lecture given to the 6th David Bennett Summer School on Intensive Care Medicine in Brijuni, Croatia, which was held between June the 20th and June the 24th, 2017, organised by David Treacher, London, UK, and Vladimir Gasparovic from Zagreb in Croatia. My name is David Green. I'm an honorary consultant anaesthetist and senior lecturer at King's Health Partners, King's College Hospital in London, UK. The title of this lecture, well, here's another nice mess you've got me into, will be revealed later on, because clearly I'm referring to the National Institute of Care and Health Excellence, and why the word mess is used will also become revealed. A few disclosures. I've received some loan monitoring equipment over the last 15 to 20 years from a number of companies listed here, from which I'm very grateful. I've also, in the last 5 years, received some honoraria and certainly travelling expenses for attending meetings from Lidco and Medtronic. I want to begin, though, by making a statement on intraoperative monitoring. There have really been no major advances in routine intraoperative monitoring from about 1992, when pulse oximetry and end-tidal CO2 were not only available, but you would have been criticised very heavily for not using monitoring of that type in 1992. Pulse oximetry had already been available for 8 years, but there was no regulation that it had to be used at that time. So we moved forward from 1992 to 2011, when first of all flow, that's cardiac output basically, and then depth of anaesthesia in 2012, monitoring were advocated by our National Institute for Health and Care Excellence in the UK, otherwise known as NICE, and that was particularly for higher risk patients. The problem is that if you look at recent systematic reviews, you will see that unlike going back 15-20 years, complications may in some cases be reduced, but not in all. But hemodynamic flow monitoring added on its own, there is no reduction in mortality. The problem in the high-risk group of patients is that 30-day and in-hospital mortality remains very high at around about 5%. And I've listed a number of recent trials which have taken place, many of which actually reveal this high level of mortality over a 30 to 90-day period. I believe that we should follow the advice of NICE and add cortical suppression, and as you'll see, follow advice from some other workers that perhaps we should also add cerebral oxygenation as part of a so-called multimodal monitoring strategy, which not only I think improves outcome, but also gives us an idea of what's physiologically happening during anaesthesia, where maybe we've been going wrong with strategies just based on the addition of flow monitoring. So the aims and objectives of this lecture then are, first of all, really to highlight, if we need highlighting these days, about the increasing numbers of patients who are elderly and who have poor outcome. We know that population over 65 is going to be anything up to 30 to 40% of the population in the UK by 2050, for example. We also, as I will explain, show that the addition of flow monitoring does little to improve outcome, and I think it's based on, as I say, misunderstanding of circulatory physiology under anaesthesia, maybe something to do the way we're using these monitors. In other words, we've got the right monitors, maybe not enough of them, but we're not using them in the correct way. We've got the wrong intervention strategy. I believe, as I've said, that additional brain monitors to optimise anaesthesia may be helpful. And really, I want to re-emphasise the importance of throughout the perioperative period, from induction of anaesthesia following to the patient going back to the ward, everybody happy, is maintaining mean arterial pressure, cardiac output, oxygen delivery. We can do that easily, but we've also got to avoid circulatory overload and unnecessary use of inotropes. I believe that multimodal monitoring allows us to do this, and if we use it sensibly, it will translate into better outcome. The first question anaesthetists often ask as they're sitting back in their chairs, perhaps reading a journal or a newspaper while the operation is going on. Is there a problem? What problem are you trying to identify? Professor Tom Healy, who was the editor of our European journal and also professor in Manchester for many years, made a statement some years ago. Anaesthesia is a disease that's been cured. There's no problem with anaesthesia on its own. It doesn't seem to produce much mortality. It's, after all, isn't it completely safe? Well, if we look at the International Surgical Outcomes Study, otherwise known as ISOS study, which followed on, if you may remember, from the USOS study, with data including 45,000 patients, and these were moderate risk patients, certainly not high risk patients, they found that a large number developed complications, but I put here only 207 died. That's 0.5%, that's 1 in 200, but that was compared with a 4% mortality in the European study, which was similar. I don't know why there's such a difference, but what they did also point out, that if you do get complications after surgery, then that is you increasing the risk of mortality of your patients, perhaps 5 to 6-fold. I think the conclusions from this study that poor patient outcomes, and this is overall, don't forget, it's not high risk patients, are common. Global initiatives not only should improve access to patient care, but also the treatments we use should be safer to give you better outcomes. Now in 2013 we did a survey in the UK on the NAP5 study. That was the one on accidental awareness under general anaesthesia. First author Mike Suri from Great Ormond Street, but including Tim Cook and J.D. Pandit on this paper and Dr. Palmer. The mortality they found, which goes along with really what Tom Healy was saying, that mortality under the care of the anaesthetist was only 1 in 2,000. Under the care of anaesthetist means during the time from induction to the anaesthetist handing over the patient in the recovery room and going back to do the next case. That's what we really mean by that. And that, of course, compares with 1 in 200 in the ISOS study in 2016. There's even here a 10-fold difference between, there was an 80-fold difference, by the way, with USOS. Now, these authors quite rightly pointed out, in inverted commas, these differences highlight the potential impact advances in perioperative care by anaesthetists, surgeons, intensivists might have on overall mortality rates after surgery. And this is really the actual rationale for this lecture. Now, I happened to take this picture in 1989, and this is now 28 years ago. King's Theatre 3, an operating room which had been built in about 1910, interestingly enough, so it was already 80 years old. But the monitoring that's on this machine looks a little bit clumsy, but it's got all the monitoring that we have today. Interestingly enough, a few years before that, in 1986, we had the introduction of the Harvard Standards of Monitoring for Anaesthesia. This was a great step forward. People were saying this is basically the minimum that we should be using. Didn't include, though, end-tidal carbon dioxide or pulse oximetry in 1986, which was some years later before that was part of the monitoring strategy. Now, I took this picture 27 years later in 2016, and basically there's no difference in monitoring capability. It looks nicer, it looks more impressive to the casual observer, but there's no difference in outcome or monitoring capability using this technology. So I believe the existing clinical context for perioperative care in high-risk patients, I'm emphasising throughout this lecture high-risk patients, there's actually very limited measurement of these additional monitoring modalities, such as depth of anaesthesia, fluid responsiveness, cardiac output, oxygen delivery, cerebral and tissue oxygenation. Importantly, as Maxime Cannison pointed out in a study both in Europe and the United States, there was no clear protocol or intervention strategy, even for the high-risk patients. And I'll mention some of that in the workshop if people want to come along to that tomorrow. Medical problems of high-risk elderly patients were pointed out in this paper by Bodett et al., looking basically at elderly patients with hip fracture. I'll come back to those patients later. You can see there's a wide variety, a large variety of possible comorbidities that elderly patients can have. As I mentioned, they're an increasing proportion of our workload, and particularly this study, still relevant I think today, although it was 7 years old now, the REASON study, prospective study in over 4,000 patients over 70, showed a 5% mortality The vast majority were elective, as I say. Now this group, Story, Kate Leslie, Paul Miles et al., so a very good group of authors here, said strategies are needed to reduce complications and mortality in older surgical patients. The problem is they didn't come up with any strategies. My view is strategies and protocols need monitors to guide our management, not any sort of recipe books like you give that patient 10 mils per kilogram per hour of that fluid, or you start an inotrope or whatever. We need strategies and protocols, need monitors. But for monitors to improve outcome, as I say, you can have the right monitor, but you can have the wrong strategy. So I think we need to look very carefully about what we're going to do with that monitor, and first of all, make sure that's correct, but secondly, make sure we actually do adhere to whatever protocol we've chosen. And so often we use the wrong protocol and we don't even adhere to that. Bottom line, in all discussions, in my opinion, about the high-risk patient or any patient, is individualizing patient care. And we also, as anaesthetists, have to be aware and have to agree that deficiencies in intraoperative management are deleterious for longer-term patient outcome. In other words, we can get the patient off the table, so under the care of the anaesthetist, the patient doesn't die, but they can have complications later on down the line. So two questions arise from these statistics. What could account for such a high mortality after major surgery in a high-risk elderly patient? And of course, very importantly, can we intervene to reduce the risk of mortality? Now, a very important study published a few years ago was a so-called VISION study, which looked at myocardial injury after non-cardiac surgery. I call it MINS. They looked at a large group of patients, just over 45. Not a very great number were the very highest risk, and they were undergoing non-cardiac surgery, remember. MINS was diagnosed by a peak troponin level of 0.03 nanograms per mil or greater. Elevated troponin, if you got it after non-cardiac surgery, is irrespective of the patient complaining or not complaining about any ischemic or anything on the ECG, independently predicted 30-day mortality with a hazard ratio of round about 4. 8% suffered myocardial injury. 60% nearly did not fulfill the universal definition. So it's only really with troponin that you can diagnose this. So only 15% of patients with MINS experience an ischemic symptom. Almost all cases will be missed with routine postoperative care. What's the message from that? Well, first of all, that MINS is common, 8% of patients over 45, and is associated with substantial mortality. Number two, according to Professor Dan Sessler, who's authored many of these papers on outcome from his Cleveland Clinic group, giving the John Severinghouse lecture last year at the ASA meeting in Chicago, we should really monitor troponin routinely in this group of patients, because there is something we can do if we do find it. Now, the optimised trial is an interesting trial. I'll come back to that briefly, and of course Dr. Rowan's is involved with this trial. But Mike Gillies, who was a registrar at King's many years ago, looked as the first author of this paper, looking at myocardial injury in patients receiving cardiac output guided hemodynamic therapy as a sub-study of the optimised trial. So they were able to look at nearly 300 of the 700 odd patients, and basically what they were looking at was to see whether introducing this hemodynamic protocol actually increased the risk of cardiac problems. I would have thought you would hope it would reduce them, but that's another matter. This was the outcome of the study. And if we look on the left-hand side, we see that these are the patients, as it were, preoperatively, with a very small 3 to 4% number having had a raised troponin. So that's usual care patient in green. Blue is the hemodynamic therapy patients. And then we move forward to 24 hours. We see that both groups, 30% had got a raised troponin, which was going to cause problems. And later on 40%, no difference between the two groups. But when you look at this high-risk patient group, what you actually see is only 65% of patients were ASA2 or 65% of patients were ASA2 or less. So only 35% or so were, say, 3 or above. So not a particularly high risk group. And there were more high risk patients in the usual care group. So why do we get myocardial injury so commonly? And I think something we can do something about, which is associated with problems, is blood pressure and, of course, cardiac output, particularly during induction and maintenance of anaesthesia. And I'm just obviously concentrating on major studies here. I can't go into all the details of all the studies, but just hopefully pointing us in the right direction. So this is a study, first author is Terry Monk, on the association between intraoperative, and I'm going to concentrate on hypotension here, and this is in a group of VA patients in the States, 18,000 patients, looking at 30-day mortality, and they had an automated blood pressure record system from basically the time of induction through to recovery. And in general, if you got low pressure, and it's admittedly low pressure, 70, 50, 30, systolic, diastolic, systolic mean and diastolic, for more than 5 minutes, this led to a 3-fold increase in 30-day mortality. Clearly then, something to be avoided. And don't forget, only 5 minutes. 5 minutes. And we often monitor pressure every 5 minutes, so we're going to miss most of these cases. So it's crucial, really, that we know what happens to not only blood pressure, but also, as we'll come on to, cardiac output, so that we can then, if we're worried about hypotension, we can make appropriate interventions to maintain it. And this has become really headline news, as it were, and as shown by this meeting in Washington on Capitol Hill, for God's sake, in the Hyatt Regency Hotel in April of this year, with none other than Monty Mython, Maxime Cannison and Dan Sessler talking about an algorithm which Edwards are looking at to try and predict the eventual hypotension. So it's really in the news and something we should be doing something about. Now, I've been using flow monitoring or cardiac output monitoring using the LIDCO Rapid and the LIDCO Plus for a number of years, and I think it's very important, as we'll come on to start measuring not only blood pressure with a radial artery line, of course, but also stroke volume cardiac output from pre-induction in your elective patients particularly. These are the cases till I stopped doing routine clinical practice in November 2014. A lot of cases elsewhere, but this is my own personal experience of 650 cases. And as you can see, elderly, high risk, long duration. Long duration is important because the longer the duration, if you're building up oxygen debt, as we'll come back to, the more likely you are to build up a big oxygen debt the longer the operation goes on. Now, a very important paper came out in 2013, very local paper from Mert Kamenik and Mirla Petran from Maribor in Slovenia, and they did induction with either etomidate or propofol, and they measured induction with the LIDCO Rapid, and they also did BIS targeted, so they made sure that they got equivalent degrees of depth of anaesthesia in both groups. What did they find over induction? Well, no surprise, blood pressure dropped by 20 to 30%. Early on with etomidate, much less. Later on, probably have the obvious contribution of the other agents you're giving. But by about 12 minutes, both of them had dropped pressure by 30%. If we look at cardiac output, we can see actually it's a cardiac output change that's driving this. In fact, the drop was driven almost entirely by this 40% drop with propofol and 30% drop overall with etomidate. So most anaesthetists, of course, don't bother with flow monitoring. If they see a drop in pressure, they'll just say, well, what are we going to do about it? They will use fluids, maybe vasoactive agents to correct change, or they may not do anything at all, of course, as we know. Now, the intraoperative fluid regimen that we use today, still used in, I would say, a majority of places, is based on the work of Tom Shires, who was Professor of Surgery in Parkland Hospital in Dallas. And this was a study, the first study in 1961, so we're now getting to 55, 56 years ago. And what they basically did was they measured changes in what they called functional extracellular fluid, later nicknamed third space, was happening during major surgery using a triple dilution technique to try and see what the changes were. And they found in some cases in major surgery, this loss could be anything up to 15 mils per kilogram per hour. We're talking about a litre an hour lost from the functional part of the extracellular fluid. So if you want to maintain extracellular fluid, functional volume, you need to replace it. And that was a litre or so an hour in some cases. So lactated ringers was used as a balanced salt solution. We now call it Hartmann's. But I would imagine that 99% of every operating room, it's got a drip up before you start. It will be either lactated ringers or Hartmann's for this reason. And this paper has continued to influence intraoperative fluid management really for over 55 years now. The study group consisted of only 13 patients. Only 13 patients. Interesting, isn't it? The fall, therefore, in mean arterial pressure you could happily then presume was due to third space loss if there was no other cause, so we could give fluids, and I call them excessive fluids because they are excess to requirements, to replace this so-called loss. Only 6 years later, 1967, before I even entered medical school, for God's sake, this statement was made. I'll put it in quotation marks. I've added a couple of brackets, but I think this statement should be up on the wall of every operating room around the world. This is what we're all about. We want to maintain or restore normal physiology, normal function of organs with a normal blood volume and functional body water and electrolytes. And that should be what we should be doing. And as the authors said, this can never be achieved by inundation with fluids. Who were the authors of these papers? Professor Moore, who was very involved, of course, in the 60s and 70s with shock and steroids, and Professor Shires, the first author of that previous paper. But of course, once the cat's out of the bag, as we say, very difficult to turn the clock back. And in 2017, patients are still receiving too much fluid with implications for poor outcome. Well, I say they're still receiving. This trial has just stopped very recently. This is the relief study, and here you have total lack of individualization. Open the card, this patient gets the liberal fluids, the other patient gets the restrictive. What's the liberal group? The commencement of surgery, we give a bolus, totally unnecessary, of balanced salt crystalloid. That would be 700-800 mils of fluid. And then you continue to give 8 mils per kilogram per hour until the end of surgery. What does that amount to? It amounts to 4 days sodium requirement in a 3-hour procedure. 4 days of sodium during 3 hours. Well, we now know, of course, more recent studies, like so many studies where the first paper is not repeated, the results are not repeatable in subsequent papers. There's no convincing evidence for this third space loss, as shown by Birgitta Brandstrup, Dan Chappell in Matthias Jacob's unit, and also, of course, a very nice paper by Gary Minto and Monty Mython in the British Journal of Anaesthesia. The notion that major surgery triggers a loss of fluid to the third space holds no foundation, and we must stop referring to lactated ringers or Hartmann's. It's maintenance solution. They're nothing of the sort. One bag of Hartmann's, as you saw, given over an hour, is 2 days worth of sodium requirement. And they followed this up with quite a nice little note in June 2016 in the newsletter of the Anaesthesia Patient Safety Foundation, with this time co-authored by Mike Grocott. Perioperative fluid management, cheers to the dream of moderation, which you might remember was the title of that 1967 paper by Moore and Shires. So let's at least, for heaven's sake, get away from excess fluids. Why not then just put an inotrope or a vasoactive agent? Question is, yes, that's I think a good ploy, but what about measuring cardiac output as well? Do we need to do that? Very important question. It has implications, obviously, for cost and so on. Well, this, I think, gives you a very good indication. It maybe is an excessive example of it, maybe, I don't know. But what it shows you here is measurement of cardiac output, systemic vascular resistance, blood pressure and stroke volume through a 10-hour procedure where the patient was being monitored with their conventional cardiac output monitor, and the LIDCO Rapid was running alongside that. Okay, that's the important thing to remember. So they start off here. I've just drawn a line over that starting cardiac output, which was pre-induction of about just over 6 litres. And you will see that during the majority of the operation, the cardiac output had dropped by about 60%. If we look at the starting stroke volume in blue, as you can see on this, at the bottom range there, you can see here that that drop in cardiac output is almost entirely due to just the drop in stroke volume. Now, what the other monitor was showing, I don't know, but as far as conventional monitoring of mean arterial pressure, 75, very nice, thank you very much. Heart rate, certainly not excessive. So conventional monitoring would not have shown there was any problem. But look what was going on with your vasoactive agents. You were getting a massive increase in SVR, which of course was keeping the pressure up, but the flow had diminished dramatically as a result. So you can maintain your mean artery if that's what you want, and good heavens, there's a lot of evidence now that you should maintain the mean arterial pressure, but if it's at the expense of cardiac output and oxygen delivery, I doubt whether it's going to produce any benefit in outcome. So it's essential we use a reliable flow monitor, and we use it from pre-induction, because you saw there again this drop in cardiac output. So we should be tracking our cardiac output and flow and oxygen delivery from pre-induction, maintaining it way into the, ideally into the post-operative period, till the patient is fully recovered from the anaesthetic and can then go back to the ward. Now, I've had a lot of, we've been bombarded in the UK in the last 10 years from various papers about better perioperative hemodynamic management, which sort of comes from what I've been saying. And it really led to the advice in 2011, 50 years interestingly after Shires et al., that we should use not just pressure monitoring but flow or cardiac output monitoring. The first company to put their hands up and say, can you look at our data dating from 2002 to about 2009? So they submitted it to NICE. NICE looked at it and said, yeah, there's some evidence here that it does actually work. But most of the data was fairly old. So in 2012, they extended their advice to include all flow monitors. And interestingly, whether or not they'd ever been validated. Now, the Deltex CardioQ has been well validated to measure flow. But some of these other monitors that are around have not been validated properly to measure flow. So let's go back to this picture from 1989. All we've basically achieved by 2011 is we had flow monitoring 22 years later. So not much of an advance, if you like, in anaesthetic monitoring. The trouble is, when you start using flow monitoring, you say, what do I do with it? What do I do with it? Well, what most people do is say, well, we want to be on the top of this so-called Frank Starling curve. It's got nothing to do really with the heart, frankly. We'll come on to that in the second half of this lecture. But they try to maximise. They try to give fluids until basically it's coming out of the patient's ears almost, trying to maximise it. And as Professor Vincent has said many times, just because you seem to be fluid responsive does not necessarily mean you need fluid. The problem with that strategy, of course, is patients who could increase cardiac output because they were relatively fit often suffered the greatest fluid overload. So the question you have to ask yourself, is this an appropriate strategy and does it work? Well, according to the Cochrane review, headed by, again, Mike Grocott, including Mark Hamilton, Monty Mython, Kathy Rowan, who's here in the audience, I think, the implementation was based basically on a reduction in complications, but there was no decrease in mortality, very short length of stay reduction, and most importantly for your 5% mortality, there was no evidence that this strategy reduced mortality, but complications, the duration of hospital stay may be reduced. Sadly, the biggest randomised controlled trial published in 2014, the so-called optimised study, did not reflect this, and in fact it did not reduce either complications or 30-day mortality. And note 4.9 versus 6.5%, so very high mortality in this study. What has all this led to? What has all this led to? It's led to people saying, look, we've got an enhanced recovery protocol, or sometimes it was called ERAS after surgery, but it's now become protocol. The surgeons have got off their backsides and have done a lot of work in trying to improve the management of the surgical patients. Do we really need goal-directed fluid therapy on top of that? The answer is yes, according to Maxime Cannison and TJ Gann, but equally well, other authors such as Henrik Keller, who introduced ERAS in the first place, and Girish Joshi from Dallas, interestingly enough, say, no, it's not the central component. As long as you've got your enhanced recovery protocol, all the things we know about enhanced recovery, then that's enough. We don't need to monitor flow. This is August last year, interestingly. We've also got a paper coming again late last year, from the VA system in Duke in support of usual perioperative care. And remember, TJ Gann worked in Duke This was an editorial basically examining the failure of goal-directed therapy in ICU, sepsis for example, but also perioperatively to produce any benefit. They point out, as I've just done, the largest such trial optimised produced no benefit. Routine goal-directed fluid therapy based on volume responsiveness, as they say, in fact, that's a very important statement, may not offer added value beyond the usual care. Oh my God. So, is it an essential component for ERAS or ERP? Well, my conclusion in this first half of the lecture is there's not as much benefit as expected. That's clear. There's been no effect on mortality or complications in recent trials. In fact, if you look at the uptake, you only have to look at the share price to see there's been little uptake by end users in the UK. And that's why I say another mess NICE has gotten us into, basically. So what's the way forward? And that will be the subject of part 2.